This is 1968, the music. 1968 was a year of conflict, confusion, and controversy. How did America make sense of it all? How do we keep from being overwhelmed, the way we always do, through the power of song? Perhaps more than any other year, in 1968, we looked to musicians for guidance. From the Beatles to Aretha, from Johnny Cash to Janis Joplin, from Jimi Hendrix to Louis Armstrong. They gave us the courage and the vision to endure war abroad and racial tensions at home. They helped us navigate '68 with such genius and passion that 50 years later, we're still singing the songs they taught us. Over the next hour, we'll look back on the artists who wrote the soundtrack to that turbulent, unforgettable year.
1968 was the critical year for many things to happen in this country.
68 was that great year between Monterey and Woodstock. That was when the hippies went from a tribe to becoming a nation, you know, so it was like all of a sudden this thing got out of control.
Their kids are doing drugs, they're letting their hair grow, they're protesting against the Vietnam War. You know, you see this big schism in families and like the hard hats versus hippies.
It seemed like there were a lot of double standards going on. You know, boys feeling like they had to be shipped off to fight and protect a country that maybe wouldn't even let them yet vote.
There was polarization, the young people against the establishment. We didn't know what to do. As disc jockeys, we didn't know which side to take either.
1968 was such a turbulent year in every way. Politics, technology, all the technology from the space program was ending up in recording studios.
Politically, there was so much going on, and musically, there was so much going on that really, we were processing it for several years afterwards.
Does the word revolution strike a feeling for you?
The musical landscape in 1968 was so dynamic, reacting to so many different influences, that the best way to begin to grasp it is to establish what it wasn't.
1968, the first thing that it meant to American popular music was that it was not 1967 anymore. And that's an important distinction to make, because 1967 was famous for being the summer of love. And the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, it was the year when hippies went to San Francisco seeking love and peace.
You look at 1967, and the Beatles put out Sgt. Pepper. It was all color and light and whimsical and psychedelic and peace and love, flower power. 1 year later, they put out the White Album, which is the darkest thing they ever did as a group.
Officially, the record's title was simply The Beatles, but its blank cover, with only the band's embossed name and a small serial number, prompted fans to rechristen it the White Album. It was the only thing about it anyone agreed on.
People at first thought it didn't cohere, and there was good reason for that. What it really was a series of solo recordings by each of the Beatles.
The White Album was not a Beatles album. It was John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And once in a while getting together, and other times on their own.
You could hear the seams between the Beatles, and there was something foreboding about that, the sense that Beatles were fragmenting.
They were on the brink of falling out.
I mean, they were together 36 hours a day, so to speak, you know? And I think that would get to anybody, really.
There was too much contained within that Beatles. You know, same for John, Paul, and Ringo. They were all growing at such a rate, and the Beatles it's like a straitjacket.
3 weeks before the White Album debuted, George Harrison became the first Beatle to release a solo record. Wonderall Music incorporated Eastern music forms and Indian instrumentation.
The Beatles in early 1968 had gone to India at George Harrison's behest to spend time learning transcendental meditation with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and Harrison was really into it. Ringo, not so much. And John and Paul, I think they both got restless.
It wasn't just the music, it was the music and the philosophy, the spirituality that went hand in hand for George.
Earlier in the year, John Lennon had gone to a gallery show by a Japanese visual artist. It proved to be a turning point in his life.
In 1968, John Lennon had met Yoko Ono. The two of them became inseparable. John began inviting Yoko to Beatles recording sessions, which was a violation of the Beatles brotherhood. They didn't allow girlfriends, spouses, any uninvited outsiders to their sessions, but John insisted on bringing Yoko.
Almost simultaneous with the White Album, John and Yoko released their own album of experimental music, Two Virgins, which stunned Beatles fans, most notoriously for its cover art, which featured a nude shot of the couple.
That was a shocker. Of course, they had to put it in a brown bag, so you didn't get to see the naughty bits till you got it home. And then it was like, well then, okay, put it back in the bag. And the music was not even avant-garde, it was really off the charts.
As for Paul McCartney, he had stepped into the leadership role after the death of the band's manager Brian Epstein in 1967, causing friction with the other Beatles.
Paul also started taking more control of the sessions, and there were some tracks on the White Album that Paul actually played the drums on, because there were times when he was showing Ringo how to do his drum part, and Ringo took I think a 2-week hiatus from the recordings because his feelings were bruised by that.
In fact, it was a happier year for the Beatles' chief rivals, the Rolling Stones. The two bands had long been in friendly competition, both on the charts and in the hearts of fans.
The Beatles were a little more on the pop R&B side, and the Stones more on the blues, darker side.
In 1967, the Stones had tried to produce their own Sgt. Pepper.
I think they understood it to be a strategic error by trying to keep up with the Beatles and make their psychedelic album, and air quotes around psychedelic, please, with their Satanic Majesty's Request, which was not a typical Rolling Stones album. But they regrouped during 1968 and made one of the year's defining albums, Beggar's Banquet, which was their return to very hard rock blues, and also a reflection on the year 1968 with two songs in particular. Sympathy for the Devil, which had the famous phrase, I shouted out, "Who killed the Kennedys? After all, it was you and me." And you had Street Fighting Man, which was a kind of commentary on the violence of the summer of '68.
The Rolling Stones' Street Fighting Man, which we all thought would be a great song to play on the air. But direct from City Hall came word that song was not to be aired.
Street Fighting Man, Rolling Stones, Beggar's Banquet was banned on radio in Chicago because they thought it would incite violence. A rock and roll record by a band from England was banned. Yeah.
I think that was one of the few times that we really felt like, hey, this is an important musical event in our lives.
Well, if you look at the lyrics, that he feels like he's a little bit out of it. He's not in the thick of it in the streets in Detroit and Newark where all that stuff was going on in 1967. So it's kind of the wistful thoughts of a guy in Britain who wants to be part of this action.
Coming up, real street fighting at the Democratic National Convention and folk music's role in protesting the war in Vietnam. Plus, singer-songwriters infiltrate Hollywood, and hippies conquer Broadway, when our journey through the sounds of 1968 continues.
Peter, Paul, and Mary. were at this point deeply, deeply involved in the anti-war movement.
Peter, Paul, and Mary had been both folk troubadours and political activists for most of the 1960s. In 1968, they put their support behind presidential hopeful Eugene McCarthy, based on his opposition to the war in Vietnam.
I had written the campaign song for him. If you love your country and the things for which it stands, vote for Gene McCarthy and bring peace to our land.
When activists came to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, prepared to challenge the party's pro-war nominee, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, they were met with violence as Chicago police brutally cracked down on protesters.
We wound up in front of the Hilton Hotel. We were staying there. The police invaded the 15th floor, which was Gene McCarthy's headquarters, and broke skulls. And I went downstairs, and there was Mary. And they saw us and they said, "Here." And I had my guitar with me, sing. And we started singing. We started, "This land is your land." We're singing this song. We're singing, "Puff the Magic Dragon." And here, underneath those helmets for the National Guard and the police, were these kids. They weren't going to fire on Puff the Magic Dragon. And I stayed there all night.
Peter, Paul, and Mary were on the front lines in 1968, but another folk music legend withdrew from the fray, instead producing his quietest, most personal album to date.
John Wesley Harding by Bob Dylan came out on December 27th, 1967. So for all intents and purposes, it was a 1968 album.
I'll be your baby tonight.
He got to a point where there was so much pressure on him to be the prophet, the voice in the desert, speaking truth to power, and he just didn't want to do it, so he totally went in a different direction.
Even though John Wesley Harding was a quiet album, had a pivotal role to play in 1968 by default in a way, because he was a big influence on two records that created new territory for rock and roll, and those records were Sweetheart of the Rodeo by the Byrds and Music from Big Pink by the Band. And both of those records from 1968 were considered the first manifestation of what became known as country rock.
John Wesley Harding and Music from Big Pink, you have to consider them both together because they were together and they bled onto each other.
One of the cornerstone tracks from that album was I Shall Be Released, one of Dylan's most moving songs.
I shall be released.
Another major influence on the folk rock scene was the state of California.
The entire music industry had relocated to Los Angeles. That was the center of things. And artists were really relocating as well. And a lot of the edgier folk and folk rock artists were going to Laurel Canyon.
You started seeing that Southern California sound, which spun off from '67, San Francisco, and that was a little harder rock, you know, except for the Grateful Dead did a lot of acoustic stuff too, but you move down further south and you get the Mamas and Papas, and you get Joni Mitchell, you get Judy Collins, and all these wonderful artists. And then Crosby, Stills, and Nash came together.
Bob Dylan's influence on the California scene was just taking root. But in the folk music mecca he'd left behind, New York's Greenwich Village, a new pair of superstars had risen up to take his place.
Simon and Garfunkel, I don't think, could do wrong. They could have just breathed during the session probably and had a hit record in '68.
They had two huge albums. One was Bookends, and the other was the soundtrack for the movie The Graduate, which became another emblematic cultural touchstone of the time.
Most of the songs were written before The Graduate was made. The only song that I wrote specifically for The Graduate was Mrs. Robinson.
And here's to you, Mrs. Robinson. Jesus loves you more than you will know. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
The new music seemed to be speaking to everyone, everywhere in 1968, including the New York stage, which in April debuted a revolutionary new musical.
Hair was unlike anything that had ever been on Broadway before. It was a series of vignettes that kind of put together and told an anti-war story, and it was done to rock music.
At the beginning of 1968, the biggest musical on Broadway was Hello, Dolly. The Great White Way was completely unprepared for its first euphoric blast of rock music.
It was rock music, definitely. Just the instrumentation. We starve, look at one another. The bass line is dun 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 dun. That's not theater, honey, that's rock.
We stop, look at one another, short of breath, walking proudly in our intercom.
The interracial aspect of it and the sexual aspects of it in terms of women playing men's roles and vice versa, that wasn't common. I have never seen that anywhere. Even if you didn't go to Broadway, you didn't see that.
It was a time of love, a time of a great deal of searching, a very great deal of confusion in our country and in our lives. And hair was the focal point. And we were the moving force of love, flower power. And hair was a revolution.
Coming up, a country music star goes behind bars to give the concert of a lifetime. Plus, a generation of women artists make their voices heard when our journey through the sounds of 1968 continues.
Johnny Cash was in '68 thinking about people that were incarcerated. He was concerned about Native Americans. He was concerned about the poor. He was really pretty political for a country and Western artist.
Johnny Cash was sort of very intrigued with the prison system and all that, partly because he had brushes with the law himself.
In 1955, Johnny Cash had hit #1 on the country charts with Folsom Prison Blues. It became one of his signature songs, and over the years he performed it everywhere, including in January 1968 at Folsom Prison itself, in a concert that was recorded and released as an album.
I'm stuck in Folsom Prison, and time keeps dragging on.
It was a pure country record, but it really showed sympathy for the convict, for the outlaw, and this was way before country music showed any identification with what Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings in the 1970s would be dubbed outlaw country music.
He was in solidarity with them, not with the guards and not with the administration. He made that really clear. That was radical, especially in '68. You know, now you wouldn't think so much about it. But Johnny Cash was a man with a real conscience, and he projected that in his music and his work and the way he conducted himself.
1968 also saw Cash's personal life take an upswing as he married his longtime lover and onstage partner, June Carter. June Carter was country music royalty when Cash was introduced to her. Johnny Cash's career wound up eclipsing his wife's, a fact she seemed to have taken in stride.
She's never had any regrets about not pursuing her own career anymore. She's very happy with the success her mother and she and her sisters have obtained.
Despite June Carter taking a back seat, women in country music became more visible than ever in 1968, including Tammy Wynette, whose mega hit, Stand By Your Man, became not only the best-selling record of her career, but one of the most covered songs in country music history.
And this was a departure. This was totally different, melody-wise, everything. And I kept telling him, please don't release it because that high note sounds like a pig squealing. Thank God he didn't listen to me, you know. He released it anyway, and Stand By Your Man is the biggest thing that I've had up to date.
Country veterans Loretta Lynn, Wanda Jackson, and Dolly Parton also had top 40 hits on the country charts in '68. And they were joined by a blockbuster newcomer.
Let's remember Harper Valley PTA, which was, I think, one of the greatest novelty records of the year.
I'd been living in Nashville for about 2 years, hoping for a break in the music business.
Jeannie C. Riley resisted recording the song because she felt it strayed too far from her roots.
I was told I was going to have a #1 pop record, and I thought, I'm going to lose my country identity before I ever gain it. And with all this anger inside, it sounded like I was really into the song, you know. And when I heard the playback, all negative thoughts that I had about it flew out the window. I got goosebumps all over, and everybody else did too.
Well, this is just a little Peyton place, and you're all Harper Valley hypocrites.
Harper Valley PTA shot to #1 on both the Billboard Country and Pop charts, dramatically launching Riley's career.
I loved it because it was just so true. And every time all of us played it, you can tell there's hypocrisy in the world, and you could see it all around you. But she brought it right out.
And it wasn't just in country music that women were stepping into the limelight. 1968 saw the debut album by Joni Mitchell and the sophomore release by Laura Nyro, two acclaimed young singer-songwriters performing their own material.
Women were just right at the brink when feminism comes in. It's not quite here yet at 68, but I think there was just a legitimacy of the music that wanted to put their voice in there too.
Women weren't just daring to be solo artists in 1968. Some also seized the traditionally male job of fronting a rock and roll band.
The two women singers who come to my mind in the rock world were Grace Slick of Jefferson Airplane. The Airplane was becoming more and more politically outspoken and more with these records, and Grace was one of the clear public faces and voices.
In loyalty to our kind, we cannot tolerate their obstruction.
And you also had Janis Joplin with Big Brother and the Holding Company. She sang with complete commitment and total abandon. Her signature prop was her bottle of Southern Comfort whiskey, and it didn't seem to be just colored water in that bottle.
The name of the band was Big Brother and the Holding Company, but the name on everyone's lips was Janis Joplin.
She was clearly on her way to stardom in 1968. She was a rocket.
Coming up, the most powerful female voice of the year and the defiant challenge she issued to America. Plus, soul music conquers the mainstream. And in the wake of an assassination, a funk music legend saves the city from violence. When her journey through the sounds of 1968 continues. The story of music in 1968 is filled with visionary, game-changing artists. But there was also one visionary, game-changing mogul, Berry Gordy.
Motown, the music of young America. Motown got criticized a lot at the time because they thought it was too white. They thought, hey, you're playing to the masses. But Berry Gordy was right up front when he said he wanted hit music, and he wanted music that sounded great in an AM radio. And he was successful at that. And he had a stable of people that might not have made it in show business if it hadn't been for Motown. He wasn't the most benevolent boss, but he gave these kids from the projects. The Supremes were 3 gals from the Brewster Projects. They were superstars. They were singing for the Queen of England.
Berry Gordy had formed Motown in Detroit in 1959. By 1968, he had a stable filled with stars he'd personally handpicked. And more often than not, handmade.
Berry Gordy had a dream, and we didn't know anything about it. We just did what we were told. We were given chaperones and we were given lessons and instructions. Whenever we were on the road actually performing, we were back in Detroit at Motown, 2648 West Grand Boulevard. In one of those offices or one of those buildings, learning something.
In 1968, Motown outgrew its original location on Grand Avenue, the house known as Hitsville. And Gordy moved his burgeoning empire into a bigger downtown office space. The move coincided with Motown's all-out assault on the pop charts. By the end of the year, Motown had 5 of the Billboard Top 10 singles and held on to the first 3 spots for an entire month. Included was one of the first Motown tunes to address a hot-button social issue. In this case, the rise of illegitimate births in inner-city communities.
It was kind of funny that Supremes were the first out of the gate with that kind of thing with Love Child. And Diana even dressed down in a little ripped sweatshirt when she was appearing on Ed Sullivan to sing that and everything. It was the writers at Motown were trying to reflect what was going on.
Berry Gordy ended the year by signing a new act to his roster, a quintet of young brothers who called themselves the Jackson 5. But as Motown welcomed its new superstars, the soul music world said goodbye to a past one.
Otis Redding, who was becoming a star, a big crossover star from his appearance at the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival. He died in a plane crash at the end of 1967. So there was a great sadness attached to his posthumous hit, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, which was a big hit in early '68.
The tune seemed in retrospect like a bittersweet elegy, and grieving fans made it Redding's first #1 record.
Sitting on the dock of the bay, wasting time.
Even as America said goodbye to Otis Redding, new acts were stepping up to fill the void on the R&B scene, exploring new and exciting concepts and forms.
When you're a teenager watching Sly and the Family Stone with that incredible white drummer, and they've got those incredible horns, Cynthia, it was just like, this is the way life is going to be from now on. From 1968 on, groups are going to be like this.
But no performer in 1968 was more visible or more influential than Aretha Franklin, who blazed a fiery new trail for both soul music and sisterhood.
But it's usually, if it was a woman, she was in a band with some guys behind her. Grace Slick, Janis Joplin, very defined roles. Or the girl groups of the early 60s. But you didn't have like a woman soul singer singing with such authority and such soulfulness and singing about wanting respect. That was big. It was very inspirational.
Aretha had 7 top 20 singles in 1968, and on June 28, became the first black woman to appear on the cover of Time magazine. She also sang the national anthem at the opening of the Democratic National Convention. But the Queen of Soul shared the year with the Godfather of Soul, who on the night of tragedy in early April used the power of music to save a city.
After the assassination of Dr. King, James Brown had a concert scheduled in Boston, and there was some question whether the concert should go on because there was fear of rioting in the black community in Boston.
They were going to cancel it like they'd canceled shows all across the country. But instead, they decided to televise it and put it on the radio live. And he had the mayor of Boston up there. He had other people give little speeches in between the songs, and he urged people not to burn their city down. And they heard that, and they didn't. They stayed home, or they went to the concert. There was no violence at the concert, and it was really one of the worst nights in our history.
Because of Brown, Boston was spared the violence other American cities suffered that night. But 1968 wasn't over.
For James Brown to come out the year after all of those riots swept cities like Newark and Detroit, and you could still see the burned out buildings, and he comes out with a song like Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, in a very fragile political environment when white people were hesitant and black people were angry and hesitant, but that he was doing this anyway. He felt it was important.
There was a need for that, the Afro-American to be proud of himself, other than feeling he was down, and letting all the derogative names take him back.
Coming up, artists scramble to reinvent themselves as a hit single gives way to the rise of the record album. Plus, once again, the Beatles break the mold as our journey through the music of 1968 continues.
His rock and roll and soul music was always a singles-based thing. Artists would put out a hit single. Most of the kids that bought those singles didn't even listen to the B-sides. I did because I was a nerd. But most kids just played the hits. That's all they wanted to hear. They didn't want to hear any album cuts. And most of the albums, frankly, you wouldn't want to hear the album cuts. The record companies would put out an album with 1 or 2 hits and then just do filler.
In the late 1960s, the evolution of the record album began picking up speed. The Beatles' 1965 album, Rubber Soul, inspired the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds in 1966, which in turn inspired the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. Now, Sgt. Pepper had inspired the next generation of ambitious high-concept albums. But the Beatles weren't just contributing to the rise of the record album. They also triggered the decline of the hit singles market by smashing the AM radio status quo.
One of the rules in Top 40 radio is the song had to be under 3 minutes long. If you went 2 minutes and 45 seconds, you were stretching it. And if they could, they'd do an edit or fade it out.
In 1968, the Beatles defiantly released a new single that ran a jaw-dropping 7 minutes and 11 seconds.
Half of it's a chant that goes on and on and on that you could easily cut out, like after 30 seconds. But no, because we would have been like calling the radio station and go, what did he just do to the Beatles? We want that back, play it, play it. And the song was such an astounding hit. It was huge across the board.
It was an anthem overnight. The first time you heard it, you knew it was going to be a standard.
Hey Jude kind of showed how the Beatles were kind of splitting between the songs of Paul McCartney and the songs of John Lennon. Hey Jude seems to be unmistakably McCartney with its melodic strength and its kind of lyrical clarity, simplicity.
The minute you let her under your skin, then you begin to make it better.
The flip side was Revolution, which was John Lennon speaking to the political conditions of 1968.
Can you imagine a 59-cent single has Hey Jude on one side and Revolution on the other? It's just unbelievable.
Hey Jude and Revolution were released exclusively as singles. But paradoxically, their success showed that artists were becoming too ambitious to be contained by the restrictive singles market, and that fans were eager to hear and buy longer and more challenging music. Focus suddenly shifted from 45s to 33 1/3, and artists had to scramble to keep up.
We had just come off of Mony Mony in the spring of '68. And we got asked by Hubert Humphrey's office, Hubert Humphrey, the vice president running for president that year, if we could join him after the convention, the Democratic convention, in, I believe it was West Virginia. We ended up doing the entire campaign with Mr. Humphrey. This had never happened before, where a rock band got together with a candidate. We left in August to do the campaign, and when we left and went on the road, it was basically all singles acts on the radio. The hottest acts were the Rascals, the Association, Gary Puckett, us. When we got back 90 days later, it was all albums. In that 90-day period, the industry turned upside down. And it was Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Led Zeppelin, Neil Young. And so we realized that we were going to have to start selling albums. And if we didn't, our career was probably over right then. We were very, very blessed and fortunate to have Crimson and Clover at that moment.
Crimson and Clover.
Crimson and Clover allowed us, and it's probably the only single we ever had that would have done this, in one swoop, to pivot from AM top 40 mono singles market to FM progressive album rock.
Other artists were better positioned to make the switch. The Doors, whose debut album in 1967 had included both longer cuts and a spoken word section, scored a doubleheader in 1968 with a #1 single and a #1 album. Other bands began flexing their creative muscles to follow suit.
I remember I couldn't wait to get home and listen to new records. It was like, there were more records coming out than you could hear. So many of them were good. Then it was like almost everything you picked up was interesting in some way or another.
Coming up, how FM radio helped the record album evolve into an art form. And the bold new genres and once taboo subject matters that flourished as a result. Plus, 1968 ends on a high note with a triumphant return of the King. As our musical voyage through 1968 continues.
With the emphasis no longer being on the hit single, the rise of FM radio was focused on these album-oriented artists.
But you've got these groups in 67 and 68, the Beatles, the Stones, Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin, Big Brother and the Holding Company, the Doors, all these bands putting out incredible albums. And they weren't getting any airplay except maybe for a hit single. Like actually Jefferson Airplane and the Doors had hit singles on top 40 radio, but you wanted to hear the other songs. That's where FM radio came in, because nobody's making money on FM radio.
Well, the culture was sort of moving to a place where people wanted to hear better sound. And you had better sound with an album, with actually a half-decent stereo setup. And then why did you want to listen to that music on a tinny AM radio when you could listen to it on FM radio with fewer commercials, less obnoxious commercials, if any?
AM radio transmits over long distances, which made it perfect for commercial broadcasting and selling pop music singles. FM's shorter range had limited it to special programming, until its very uncommerciality made it ideal for reaching discriminating music fans.
So a lot of people were expressing themselves at great length and making longer albums that perhaps the new expansiveness of FM radio had encouraged them to do. This was the same year, after all, that the original kind of definitive heavy metal album was made by the group Iron Butterfly, with its 17-minute long title song known as In-A-Gata Da Vida.
In-A-Gata Da Vida, honey, don't you know that I'm loving you?
The music was begging to be heard on the radio, so FM radio was the only place to do it. Plus the quality of the sound, the signal's very different.
Artists who had been pushing the envelope for years suddenly found that the sky was the limit.
One group that really hit its peak in 1968 was the British rock trio Cream, with Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, and Ginger Baker. The classic rock Stand By Sunshine of Your Love was a big hit in early 1968. And Cream was a band that kind of typified the louder, more intense clash of musicianship and clash of egos that eventually changed rock culture.
Well, The Sunshine of Your Love, which was such a great song, that's the one that I remember, the one that just grabbed us, and it just, all of a sudden, we had a new sound, and from that, we kept evolving. It just a beautiful, refreshing sound to those of us that were waiting for it.
You also had, in 1968, the establishment of Jimi Hendrix as both a sort of the guitar hero and the iconic rock star of the time. And Hendrix was flamboyant, he was tremendously gifted guitar player. Hendrix's two albums that were key in 1968, Axis Bold as Love, and the two records set Electric Ladyland.
After so much change, so much breaking of new ground, the last thing anyone expected as 1968 drew to a close was a triumphant blast from the past. On December 3rd, America was riveted by the resurrection of a legend it had all but forgotten.
1968 was the year Elvis came back. It took him pretty much all of the year to do it. While the rock revolution was going on, Elvis was making movies like Clam Bake.
In '68, he was as relevant as Liberace.
He was only 33 years old. To teenagers, he was from a different era. He was sort of a has-been.
With his chain of #1 records long ended and his movie career fading fast, Elvis made a deal to star in his first television special. It was originally meant to be an hour of Christmas carols, but his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, thought it was better used as a means of restoring Elvis's rock and roll credentials. It was a fateful decision, as a return to the blues and gospel-influenced material of his early career re-energized Elvis before viewers' eyes.
And I remember watching it and being totally blown away. That set where he comes on with the leather outfit with his musicians and people sitting right around him and he's doing the old rockabilly stuff, that was priceless.
Here's this guy, he's really handsome, he's wearing black leather, and we could see why those 1950s singles, why they were so great, because he was doing them again with such energy and passion.
But the year's most unlikely comeback was that of a performer who had been around even longer than Elvis, Louis Armstrong. The virtuoso trumpeter who had been a guiding force in jazz since the 1920s surprised the world by releasing a sweet, soothing ballad that unexpectedly proved to be exactly what the year needed.
What a wonderful world. In '68, when I heard it the first time, I said, God, here it is, something positive. I said, here's something that really builds you up. To me, it was a personal lift. It was an optimistic sound.
I see skies of blue, clouds of white.
1968 was a year of extremes, both political and musical.
It's very hard for us to put our finger on what the sound of 1968 was. Was it music from Big Pink? Was it Inagata Davida? Was it Street Fighting Man? Was it the Beatles' White album?
In the end, Louis Armstrong alone seemed able to bring it all together in perfect harmony.
Because everybody loved that song. The hippies loved that song. The conservatives loved that song. Everybody loved that song. It was universal. It's beautiful. That's what Louis Armstrong did for us in '68. He had the kids and the grown-ups all singing together, and that's what music can do.
What a wonderful world.
1968 was a half-century ago, and so much of that world seems increasingly remote to us today. But the music we've examined over the past hour still resonates in a way that seems as vital to us as the songs of our own time. And it seems likely it'll keep on resonating for another half-century to come. That'll do it for us today. I'm Ellie Pai Hong. As we leave, one last look at the musical highlights of the year, 1968.